The Wyoming Trail. 2 hours from any living soul. A wagon leans hard against a broken axle. A mare stands spent in the trace's head, low foam at her mouth. And on the ground, a woman on her hands and knees in the August dust. 7 months pregnant. Alone. Under one arm, she still holds a small cedar box. She has not let it go in 11 days. She does not intend to. Then hoofbeats on the switchback above her. 3 riders on the ridge. The lead one has a black hat pulled low, a rifle across his saddle, a face that has forgotten how to speak to anything but horses. He looks down at her a long moment. Then he starts down the trail. Not fast, not slow, steady. Like a man who does not know yet what the ground beneath him is about to demand. I'll rewrite the complete story with all fixes applied. Let me work through this carefully. Part 1. The wagon wheel broke first. That was how Cordelia Calloway would remember it later. Not the pain, not the heat, just the sound. A dry crack like a rifle shot in an empty church, and then the wagon tilting, and then the world going sideways. She was on her hands and knees before she understood she had fallen. The Wyoming sun sat directly above her. It did not care that she was 28 years old. It did not care that she was 7 months pregnant. It did not care that her husband had been dead for 4 months and that she had walked out of Missouri with $47 in her pocket and a cedar box under her arm and a promise she was not sure she could keep. The sun did what suns do in August. It burned. Cordelia pressed one palm flat to the dirt. The other went to her side. Because something inside her had shifted when the wagon dropped. Something low and tight. Not the baby. Please God, not the baby. Her mare Bessie stood in the traces with her head down, foam at the corners of her mouth. She had done everything Cordelia had asked of her for 3 straight days, and now she had nothing left to give. Bessie, Cordelia whispered. The mare did not lift her head. Cordelia tried to stand, except her legs would not agree. She sat back on her heels and looked at the sky and thought about William, about the way he had held her hand the night before he died, about the way he had said, "Go west, go north, get to Harriet. Don't stop, sweetheart. Don't ever stop." She had stopped now. The trail wound up into the Bighorn Mountains ahead of her. Pine dark, enormous, empty. "Please," she said to no one, because there was no one. Somebody. The wind moved through the grass, and then hoofbeats. At first she thought she had imagined them, because that was what a mind did to a woman alone in the heat. It gave her the sound of rescue and then took it back. She had lived through enough disappointment to know. But the hoofbeats did not stop. 3 horses, coming down the switchback from the north. Cordelia turned her head slowly. She was very tired. She did not have the strength to be afraid the way a woman should be afraid. She had used all that strength up somewhere back in Nebraska. She saw them. 3 men on the ridge above her, silhouettes against the sky. Big men, broad-shouldered, rifles across their saddles. The lead rider stopped his horse and just looked down at her for what felt like a long time. Then he came down the trail at a walk. Not fast, not slow, just steady, like a man who did not need to hurry because the ground was already his. The other 2 followed. They stopped 10 feet away. The lead rider swung down from the saddle without a word. He was older than the other 2, late 30s, sun-weathered, dark hair, a jaw set the way men's jaws set when they had learned very young that talking was not the same as thinking. He wore a black hat pulled low and a coat that had seen weather. His hands were empty. He kept them where she could see them. He crossed the 10 feet between them without ceremony. He stopped at her side. He crouched down and he looked at her. Not at her belly, not at her broken wagon, not at her spent horse, at her face. Cordelia looked back because she did not know what else to do. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low, careful, the kind of voice a man used when he had spent years talking mostly to horses. "My name is Wesley Blackwood." She tried to speak. She could not. "That's my brother Ambrose," he said, and nodded toward the second rider. "And that's Fletcher, youngest of the three." Ambrose was still on his horse. 34 years old, a scar cut down his left cheek from temple to jaw. Not a fresh one, an old one. The kind a man got when he was young and angry and did not know yet that some things could not be taken back. Fletcher was already on the ground. 26, freckled across the nose, sandy hair, a face that had not yet learned to hide what it felt. He was carrying a canteen. He was moving toward her, and he was watching Wesley the way younger brothers watched older ones, for permission. Wesley nodded once. Fletcher knelt beside her and offered the canteen. Cordelia took it with both hands. She drank, not too fast. William had taught her that once, about water and heat and how a body could shock itself if it drank too much all at once. She drank slow. She handed the canteen back. "Thank you," she whispered. Fletcher smiled, small, real. "You're welcome, ma'am." Wesley had not moved. He was still crouched at her side, still watching her face. "What's your name?" he said. "Cordelia." She swallowed, tried again. Her voice came out stronger. "Cordelia Calloway." Something happened in Wesley's face when she said the name. She missed it. Because she was tired. Because the pain in her side was pulsing now. Because the sun was still burning and her horse was still spent, and she still had no wagon, and she did not know these three men from Adam. But Ambrose caught it. Wesley's brother caught the flicker, because Ambrose had been reading Wesley's face for 34 years. And Ambrose saw the name land like a stone dropped in still water. He said nothing. He swung down from his horse instead, and walked past his brother and past Cordelia to the broken wagon. He crouched by the wheel. He looked. He was still for a long moment. Then he stood up. He turned to Wesley. He said one word. "Tampered." Wesley did not react. He kept looking at Cordelia. But something in the air between the three brothers changed. Cordelia felt it before she understood it. The way a woman feels, weather changing before she sees the clouds. Fletcher stopped smiling. Wesley finally spoke. "Can you stand, Mrs. Calloway?" Not a question. He was not asking. He was telling her the plan. "I think so. If you reach up, I've got you." She reached up. He caught her under the elbows and lifted her the way a man lifts something he does not want to break. Careful, deliberate, without ceremony. She stood. She swayed. His hand stayed at her elbow until she was steady. Then he let go. "How far along?" he said. "Almost 8 months." He nodded once, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "You ride with us." That was it. 5 words, no explanation, No question, just the decision made. Cordelia stared at him. "I don't know you," she said. "No." Wesley agreed. "You don't." He turned to Ambrose. "Get the trunk, the cedar box, anything she says she cannot leave." Ambrose was already climbing into the wagon. Fletcher was already moving toward Bessie, talking to the mare low, untangling the traces, freeing her from the wagon. Cordelia looked at the three brothers, moving around her like she was the center of some quiet and practiced dance. And she thought, "God help me," because she did not know if this was rescue or something else. But her body knew. Her body was letting go. Muscles she had been holding tight for 4 months were beginning to release. And that was terrifying too, because she did not know what would come out of her if she let go now. Wesley was watching her. He said, "Ma'am." She looked at him. "I have brothers," he said. "I have a horse. I have a rifle. I have a ranch, 2 hours up this trail with 3 empty bedrooms in it. And I have exactly no interest in whatever you're running from." He held her eyes. "But I am not leaving you on this road." Something in Cordelia's chest cracked open. She did not cry. She had used up her crying somewhere back in Kansas. She just nodded. "All right," she said. "All right," he said back. And that was how she came off that trail. She rode on Wesley's horse. He walked beside her. Ambrose rode ahead with the trunk lashed to his own saddle. Fletcher brought up the rear leading Bessie. The mare followed on a loose lead, head still low, but moving. Nobody talked much. Cordelia had one hand on the saddle horn and one arm curled around the cedar box in her lap. The box was small, 12 inches long, latched shut. William had made it himself the winter before he died. She had not opened it in 7 days. She did not need to. She knew what was inside. The trail climbed. The pines got thicker. The air got cooler. Cordelia had not felt cool air in 3 weeks. She closed her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. And when she opened them, Wesley was looking up at her. "You all right?" he said. "Yeah." "You'll tell me if you're not." Not a question again. A statement. She nodded. They rode. After a while she said, "You didn't ask who I'm running from." Wesley kept walking. "No, ma'am, I didn't." "Why not?" He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that meant he was picking words the way a man picks stones out of a creek, careful about which ones he lifted. Finally he said, "Because you're going to tell me anyway, when you're ready." She looked down at his hat brim. "How do you know I'm going to tell you?" "Because you brought that box down off the wagon and you didn't leave the trunk. That means the box is the reason. And the reason is what you're running from." She stared at him. "That's a lot of assumption, Mr. Blackwood." "Wesley." "Wesley." "Yes, ma'am. It is." He kept walking. They came up out of the switchback and onto a long meadow. The bighorns rose to the west. Snow still on the highest peaks, even in August. The grass in the meadow was gold. A hawk circled somewhere very high. Fletcher came up beside them. "Wes." Wesley did not slow. "Yeah." "Bessie's leg is swelling, left front." "Can she make it to the ranch?" "Barely." Wesley looked at Fletcher. Fletcher looked at Cordelia. Cordelia understood without being told. Bessie had been William's horse. Bessie had pulled the wagon out of Missouri and across 4 states and up into the Bighorn Mountains. And Bessie was done. She has to make it, Cordelia said. Fletcher nodded slow. Yes, ma'am. I'll walk her easy. He fell back. Wesley kept walking. Cordelia watched the hawk. That was my husband's horse, she said, because she had to say it out loud to someone. I figured. His name was William. Yes, ma'am. He died in April. I am sorry. 2 words, flat but not empty. She heard the difference. She said, How did you know I was going to say his name? I didn't, but you said was, not is, so I knew. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, Wesley. Yes, ma'am. Please stop calling me ma'am. Yes, Cordelia. She almost smiled, almost. The ranch came into view an hour before sundown. It sat in a fold of the mountain, not on top, not at the bottom, tucked in like something that did not want to be noticed. A main house of dark timber, a barn, a pasture with 4 horses in it, split rail fences going out to the tree line. Cordelia sat up straighter in the saddle, because the house was not what she had expected. She had expected a cabin, a rough thing, 2 rooms maybe, because Wesley Blackwood looked like the kind of man who lived rough. But this was a house. 2 stories, wraparound porch, a stone chimney, curtains in the windows, curtains. Someone had hung curtains in the windows of this house on the side of a mountain in Wyoming territory. She looked at Wesley. Your wife did the curtains, she said. He stopped walking for exactly 1 heartbeat. Then he kept walking. My mother, he said. She died 20 years ago. Cordelia felt something hollow open up under her sternum. She had not meant to touch that place. She had not known there was a place to touch. I'm sorry. No, Cordelia, it is all right. He did not look up at her, but he said, The curtains are hers. So is the room you'll be sleeping in, my mother's room. Nobody's used it in 20 years, except for the airing out. Cordelia looked at the house. She thought about a woman who had hung curtains in the wilderness. A woman who had raised 3 sons on the side of a mountain. A woman who had made a home that had outlived her by 20 years. She thought about William, about the house they had rented in St. Joseph, about the curtains she had never gotten around to hanging. She thought, I want to hang curtains before I die. The thought surprised her so much she nearly said it out loud. She did not. They came through the gate. Ambrose was already in the yard. He had the trunk off his horse and on the porch. He was watching them come in with his arms crossed over his chest. His face gave nothing. Wesley led the horse to the porch steps. He reached up. Cordelia leaned down. He caught her under the arms and lifted her down like she weighed nothing, which she did not with a baby inside her. But he did it anyway, steady, careful, without ceremony. He set her on the porch. Ambrose will show you your room. She looked up at Ambrose. Ambrose looked at his brother. Something passed between them. Cordelia did not know what. Then Ambrose nodded. Ma'am. He picked up the trunk like it weighed nothing and turned toward the door. Cordelia followed with the cedar box. At the door she stopped. She turned back. Wesley was still standing by the porch steps, not moving. Wesley. Yes. Why are you doing this? He looked at her. The sun was on his face, and for just a second, she saw something in his eyes that she recognized. Something she had seen in her own mirror every morning for 4 months. Grief, the old kind, the kind that had settled in and become the furniture. He said, because it is right. She held his eyes. All right, she said. All right, he said back. She went inside. The room was plain. A bed, a dresser, a washstand with a pitcher, a window that looked west toward the mountains. The bed had a quilt on it, blue and cream, well made. Someone had aired the quilt recently. It smelled like sage and pine and clean cotton. Cordelia sat down on the edge of the bed. She sat for a long time. Ambrose had put the trunk at the foot of the bed and closed the door behind him and not said one word the whole time. She had not been sure whether that was politeness or disapproval. She was still not sure, but she was inside, under a roof for the first time in 7 days. She put a hand on her belly. "We're all right," she whispered. "We're all right, little one." The baby moved, just a nudge, small, reassuring. Cordelia closed her eyes. She sat there until the light in the window turned gold and then orange. And then someone knocked on the door. Fletcher. "Mom, Wesley says supper's on if you can eat." She opened the door. Fletcher was standing in the hallway with his hat in his hands, which was funny to her, because they were inside his own house and he was standing in his own hallway. But he had taken his hat off for her. He had held it in front of himself, the way a boy holds a hat in front of a preacher. She almost smiled. "I can eat," she said. He led her down the hall. The kitchen was warm, a cast iron stove in the corner, a long pine table, 3 chairs on one side, one on the other. A 4th had been dragged over from somewhere for her. Wesley was already at the table. Ambrose was at the stove, turning something in a pan. He was cooking. Ambrose Blackwood, with the scar and the crossed arms and the flat expression, was cooking. Cordelia had not seen that coming. He glanced over his shoulder. He said, "Sit." She sat. Fletcher took the chair beside her. Wesley was across from her. Ambrose brought the food to the table. Salt pork, beans, cornbread that looked like it had been made that morning, coffee. Cordelia looked at the food. She had not eaten a meal at a table in 7 days. She had been eating whatever she could hold in one hand while she drove the wagon. Her eyes filled up. She blinked hard, because she was not going to cry over cornbread. She was not. Except she almost did. She said, "This looks wonderful." Ambrose grunted, which she was beginning to understand was his equivalent of a full paragraph. Wesley said, "Eat, Cordelia. It is better hot." She ate. Nobody talked for a while. Then Fletcher, who apparently could not stand silence for long stretches, said, "So where are you from, ma'am?" "Missouri." "Long way." "Yes." "You come alone?" "Yes." Fletcher whistled. "In your condition." Ambrose said, "Fletcher." Fletcher said, "What? I am making conversation." Wesley said, "Eat your supper." Fletcher grinned at Cordelia. "Sorry, ma'am. Ambrose says I talk too much. Wesley says I think too little. My mother used to say I do both at the same time, which is why the good Lord gave me freckles, so people would know to be patient with me." Cordelia laughed. It came out small, but it was real. She put a hand over her mouth, like she was surprised she still knew how. Fletcher looked pleased with himself. Ambrose almost smiled. Wesley just watched her from across the table. Watched her the way a man watches a hawk come down into his yard. Careful, interested, not sure yet what to make of it. She met his eyes. He looked away first, which surprised both of them. After supper, she told them. She had not planned to. She had planned to wait a day, 2 days, until she was rested, until she understood these three brothers better, until she could tell if the older one was going to help her or turn her over to Cross for the price of a good horse. But something about the kitchen, something about the cornbread, something about Fletcher laughing at his own joke, something about the look on Wesley's face when he looked away. She told them. She put the cedar box on the table. She undid the latch. She said my husband was a surveyor. He worked out of the St. Joseph office. About a year before he died, he started noticing that something was wrong with the land grant documents coming out of the territorial office in Cheyenne. Ambrose set his coffee cup down slowly. He found forged signatures, Cordelia said. Surveys signed by dead men, parcels that appeared on the official maps but did not match the physical land. He gathered evidence for 4 months. He was going to take it to the federal land office, in person. She opened the box. The papers were on top. She lifted a few out and set them on the table. He got sick in March. He died in April. He told me about the box 2 days before he died, and he made me promise to get it to the federal office. She looked at Wesley. The man behind the fraud is named Harlan Cross. He controls most of the land grant process in this county and 3 counties over. If these papers reach the federal office, he loses everything. He knows I have them. He sent men to my house in Missouri. He offered me $500 to hand them over. I closed the door on them. She swallowed. 2 weeks later, I left. I have been running for 11 days. She stopped. She waited. Wesley had not moved. Ambrose had not moved. Fletcher had not moved. The kitchen was very quiet. Then Wesley said, "The wheel." "I believe so. Yes." Ambrose was looking at the papers on the table. He had not touched them yet. His arms were crossed again. His face was not giving anything. Then he leaned forward just slightly. He said, "May I?" "Please." He picked up the top page. He read it. He turned it over. Read the back. Set it down. Picked up the next one. He read 3 more. Then he stopped on the 4th. He stared at it for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "Wes." Wesley looked at him. "This is Voss." Wesley went completely still. "What?" Ambrose turned the paper around and slid it across the table. He pointed at a signature at the bottom. Wesley leaned forward. He read the signature. He read it again. Something happened in his face that Cordelia did not understand. He looked at Ambrose. Ambrose looked back. Nobody spoke. Fletcher looked between his brothers. "Who is Voss?" he said. Ambrose did not answer. Wesley cleared his throat. "Corporal Elias Voss," Wesley said. "He was a soldier at Antietam, 62. Fletcher frowned. "I do not know that name." "You wouldn't. You were a baby." Wesley looked down at the paper. He touched the signature with one fingertip, like he was checking to make sure it was real. "Voss served with Pa," he said. Very quiet. "2nd Wisconsin, Iron Brigade." When the line broke at the cornfield, Pa took a ball in the leg and went down. Voss carried him out. Fletcher said, "Oh." Ambrose said, "Yeah." Cordelia looked between them. "He saved your father's life." "Yes, ma'am." "What happened to him?" Wesley kept looking at the signature. "He came home after the war. Homesteaded a claim outside the Big Horn settlement. Ran cattle for a while. Died of pneumonia in the winter of '77. He was 63 years old. He did not have any family left. Pa was the last friend he had. Wesley finally looked up. His eyes were different now. Pa died in 75, 2 years before Voss did. But before he went, Pa made us promise. If Voss ever needed anything, money, a hand at his place, a shoulder, we were to give it to him, because Pa said that if Voss had not carried him out of that cornfield, none of us would exist. He looked at Cordelia. Voss died before we could ever pay that debt. The room was quiet. Cordelia looked at the signature on the paper. Elias Voss, signed on a survey dated 1878, a year after the man had been dead. She whispered, "Cross used a dead man's name." "Yes." "Your father's friend." "Yes." Wesley set the paper down very carefully. He looked at his brothers. Ambrose was looking at the floor. His jaw was working. Fletcher had gone pale under his freckles. Wesley said, "Mrs. Calloway." Cordelia looked at him. "I told you on the trail I had no interest in what you were running from." "Yes." "I was going to help you anyway, because it is right." "Yeah." He looked at the signature again. "But this is not just right anymore." She waited. "This is ours," he said. The three brothers looked at each other across the table. Nothing else needed to be said. Cordelia understood. She had walked 11 days out of Missouri, carrying a box she was not sure anybody would ever help her deliver. She had prayed every night on the trail, not for herself, for William, for the promise, for the baby. And somewhere in that prayer, God had put a broken wagon wheel on a Wyoming trail and 3 Blackwood brothers on a ridge above her, and a dead soldier named Elias Voss, whose name she had never heard before that day. She looked at Wesley. She could not speak. She just nodded. He nodded back. That night, she slept in his mother's room. The quilt smelled like sage and pine. The window was open a crack. The wind came down off the bighorns cool and clean. She lay on her side with one hand on her belly and one hand under her cheek, and she listened to the house. She could hear Wesley in the front room. He was not sleeping. He was sitting up. She had seen him sit down in the chair by the window when Ambrose walked her to her room. He had a rifle across his knees. He had not asked her if she wanted him to sit up. He had just done it. Cordelia lay there and thought about that. She had not been protected by anyone in 4 months. She had forgotten what it felt like. It felt like a hand under her elbow, steady, deliberate, without ceremony. She closed her eyes. The baby moved. She whispered, "We're all right, little one. We're all right." And she slept. She woke at first light to the smell of coffee. She dressed slowly, because everything took time now. She braided her hair and washed her face in the pitcher basin and stood at the window and looked out at the mountains for a long moment. The sun was just coming over the eastern ridge. The air was cool. She was still alive. The baby was still alive. Somebody had made coffee. It was a good morning. The first good morning in a long time. She stood at the window and let herself have it. Then she went to the kitchen. Wesley was at the table, coffee in front of him. He had not shaved. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had not slept. He looked up when she came in. "Morning." "Morning." He poured a second cup and set it across from him. She sat down. Ambrose was already outside. She could see him through the window, working on the wagon with Fletcher. They had brought the wagon up the mountain overnight. Both brothers had gone back for it after supper. She had not known. She looked at Wesley. You went back for my wagon. Fletcher and Ambrose did. I stayed here. Why? He looked at his coffee. Because someone needed to be here in case Cross's men came in the night. She held the coffee cup with both hands. Did they come? No, not yet. Not yet. 2 words. She set the cup down. Wesley. Yes. How long do we have before they find this ranch? He was quiet. Then he said, Ambrose and I think 2 days, maybe 3. Cross has men who watch the main trails. If they saw us come up the switchback with a woman and a wagon, they will be up here inside of 48 hours. 48 hours. She put both hands flat on the table. I have sent Fletcher this morning, Wesley said. He is riding to the Brannigan place. That is our nearest neighbors, 4 miles south. Their boy will ride down to Buffalo and send word to a federal deputy marshal I know. Man by the name of Aldous Graves. He owes me a favor. And more than that, he is honest. How long before he can get here? If the message goes out today, 3 days, maybe 4 if he is on a case. Cordelia looked at her hands. 3 or 4 days. 48 hours before Cross came. The math did not work. She said it out loud. The math does not work, Wesley. No, it does not. She looked at him. Then what? Then we hold the ranch until the marshal gets here. Ambrose and Fletcher and me. And I would like you to stay in this house, away from windows, away from the door. Cross knows what he wants, and he will come for it. But he will not get past the 3 of us. She stared at him. You have known me for less than a day. Yes. You are willing to hold your house against a man with money and hired guns for me. For Voss, he said quietly. For Pa. For William Calloway, who I never met. For a promise I have been carrying since 75 that I did not know I still owed. He looked at her. And for you, and that baby, yes. The morning light came through the window. Cordelia felt something she had not felt in 4 months. Not hope exactly. Something quieter. She said, I do not know how to thank you. Don't. He drank his coffee. Just eat, he said. Ambrose is bringing eggs in. Ambrose brought eggs in. He set the basket on the counter and washed his hands at the pump. Then he pulled the cast iron off the stove and started cracking eggs one-handed, like a man who had done it 10,000 times. Cordelia watched him. She said, You cook every meal in this house, don't you? Ambrose grunted. Wesley said, Yes. Cordelia said, Why? Ambrose kept cracking egg. Wesley said, Because if I cook, we starve. And if Fletcher cooks, the house catches on fire. Ambrose is the one who kept us alive after Ma died. Ambrose said, without turning around, Somebody had to. Cordelia looked at his back. She thought about a 14-year-old boy learning to cook because his mother had died, and his little brothers were hungry, and nobody else was going to do it. She thought about a scar down the left cheek. She thought about crossed arms and a flat face. She said, Would you teach me how you make the cornbread? Ambrose stopped cracking eggs. He turned around, just a little, just enough to look at her over his shoulder. You cook. I cook, not as well as you, but I cook. He almost smiled. She saw the corner of his mouth move. It was the first time she had seen his mouth move at all in that direction. He said, After breakfast. He turned back to the eggs. Wesley was watching her over his coffee. She could not read his face, but she felt something in the room shift. A small thing, a tiny adjustment, like a door that had been closed for a long time being opened just a crack, just enough to let the air move through. She drank her coffee. She waited for breakfast. Fletcher came back at noon. He came in through the door, dusty and hungry, and full of news. "The Brannigan boy is on his way to Buffalo," he said. "He left within the hour. He will ride hard. Marshal Graves will get the message tomorrow evening at the latest." Wesley nodded. "Good." Fletcher was pouring himself coffee, but he was also looking at Cordelia the way a young man looks at something he cannot quite figure out. "Ma'am." "Yes, Fletcher. Can I ask you something?" "You may." "How do you know the storm is coming tomorrow?" Cordelia set her cup down slowly, because she had said it that morning to Ambrose, in passing. She had watched a flock of chimney swifts fly low across the pasture, and she had watched the way the wind moved in the tops of the pines, and she had said, without thinking, "Storm coming, 2 days out, maybe less." Ambrose had heard her. Ambrose had told Fletcher. She looked at Fletcher now, then at Wesley. Wesley was watching her too. She said, "My mother taught me." "Taught you what?" "How to read weather." Fletcher looked skeptical. "From what?" "From birds, from wind, from the way pine trees hold their needles when pressure drops, from the color of a sunset, small things." Fletcher looked at Wesley. Wesley said, "Show us." Cordelia stood up. She walked to the window. She looked out at the pasture. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The swifts are flying low again. That means the air is heavy. That means moisture. The wind is out of the northwest, but it is shifting west. That means the front is moving faster than yesterday. The horses in your pasture are grouped along the tree line, not the water. They can feel the pressure drop too." She turned back to the room. "Storm tomorrow, late afternoon, big one, rain and hail, lasts through the night." She looked at Fletcher. "My mother was a farmer's daughter, Kansas. Her father lost half their crop in 1852 because he did not read a sky right. My mother made a study of it after that. She taught me. She said a woman who could read weather could feed a family for a year." Ambrose said from the stove, "Handy skill." Wesley said, "Very handy." He was looking at her differently now. Not the careful look he had used on the trail. Not the watching look he had used at supper. Something else. Something she could not name. She sat back down. "My mother died 3 years ago," she said, because she felt like she had to explain the past tense. Nobody said sorry, which was somehow the right response. She had gotten tired of sorries. Fletcher said, "Then I will get the hay in the barn today. If a storm is coming tomorrow, I do not want it in the field." Wesley said, "Good." Ambrose said, "I will close up the tack room." The three of them looked at Cordelia. They believed her, just like that. She had told them once, and they had believed her. She did not know what to do with that. She looked at her coffee cup. She said, "Thank you." Wesley said, "For what?" "For believing me." He looked at her a long moment. Then he said, "You believed me last night." She looked up. He said, "About Voss, about Pa, about holding this house until the marshal comes. You believed a man you had known for 6 hours." He held her eyes. "So yes, when you tell me a storm is coming tomorrow, I believe you." She could not speak. She just nodded. He nodded back. And that was how the second day began. She was in the kitchen with Ambrose that afternoon when she heard Fletcher call from the porch. She had her hands in flour. Ambrose was showing her the cornbread. He had walked her through the measurements twice. He had not smiled, but he had not been impatient, and that was more than most men she had known. Then Fletcher called. "Wes, you want to come see the—" Not urgent, not panicked, but not casual either. Cordelia felt her stomach drop. Ambrose set the wooden spoon down and wiped his hands on a rag. He said quietly, "Stay in here." He walked out. Cordelia stood at the counter with flour on her hands. She heard the three brothers on the porch. Low voices. She could not make out words. Then a longer silence. Then Wesley came back into the kitchen. He was carrying his rifle now. He had not been carrying it before. He set it against the wall by the door. He looked at her. "There is a rider on the ridge to the north," he said. "Alone. Been sitting a horse in the tree line for 20 minutes, watching the house." Cordelia held onto the counter. "Crosses." "Probably. Ambrose is going to circle around the back of the ridge and get a look without being seen. Fletcher is on the porch with the second rifle. I want you to stay in this kitchen and away from the front windows." "All right." He turned to go. Then he stopped. He turned back. "Cordelia." "Yeah. If you hear a shot, any shot, you go to my mother's room. You lock the door. You get under the bed. You do not come out until you hear my voice, or Ambrose's voice, or Fletcher's voice. Do you understand?" "Yeah." "Say it back to me." "I go to your mother's room. I lock the door. I get under the bed. I do not come out until I hear one of your voices." "Good." He picked up the rifle again. He looked at her one more time. His face was set the way it had been set on the trail. Not angry, not scared, just decided. "Nobody gets past me," he said. He walked out. Cordelia stood at the counter. The flour was still on her hands. The cornbread was still in the bowl. The baby moved inside her. Small nudge right below her ribs. "We're all right, little one," she whispered. But she was not sure that was true. Ambrose was gone for an hour. The longest hour of Cordelia's life. She did not stand at the window. She had promised Wesley. But she stood in the kitchen and she listened. Every creak of the porch, every whicker of a horse, every gust of wind through the eaves. She catalogued it all. Then she heard Ambrose come back. Not a shot, not a shout, just hoofbeats from the back trail. Slow, steady. She heard him come into the house. She heard him say, "Wes." She heard Wesley say, "Well." Silence. Then Ambrose said, very slow, "It's a woman." Cordelia's head snapped up. Wesley said, "Say that again." "It is a woman. On the ridge, grey horse, riding side saddle. She is not carrying a rifle. She is carrying a satchel." "A woman, yes, and Wes." "What?" Ambrose was quiet for a long moment. Cordelia could hear him breathing all the way in the kitchen. Then he said, "I know her." Wesley said, "What do you mean, you know her?" "I mean, I know her from when I was small, from before." "Ambrose." "What?" "Say it." Ambrose said, "It is Aunt Prudence." The house went completely quiet. Cordelia was standing at the counter with flour on her hands. She did not know who Aunt Prudence was. She did not know why the name had landed in the front room like a stone dropped through a window. but she understood from the silence that it had. Then Wesley said, "She has been gone 27 years. Yes. She left after she fought with Pa, before Fletcher was born. Yeah." Ambrose, why is our aunt sitting on the ridge above our ranch, watching our house on the same day a hired man tampered with a widow's wagon wheel? Ambrose said, "I do not know, Wes." Cordelia set the wooden spoon down. She walked into the front room. She could not help it. The three brothers were standing near the front window. Wesley at the center, Ambrose to his right, Fletcher on the porch still with the rifle. Nobody had heard her come in. She said, "Wesley." He turned. She said, "Please tell me who Aunt Prudence is." He looked at her. He looked at his brothers. Fletcher came in from the porch. He looked younger than he had all day. He said, "Wes, should we bring her in?" Wesley did not answer. He was still looking at Cordelia. Then he said very slow, "Aunt Prudence is our mother's sister. She was here when Ambrose and I were boys. She fought with our father in '52, and she rode off that same night, and none of us have seen her since. Fletcher never met her at all. He was not born yet." He held Cordelia's eyes. "I do not know why she is here. I do not know what she wants. I do not know if she is alone or if there are others behind her. I do not know if she is here for us or for you." He picked up his rifle. "But I aim to find out." He looked at Fletcher. "Get the horses ready, both of them. I want you and me down that ridge and out to meet her before she comes any closer. Ambrose stays here with Cordelia." Fletcher nodded and went. Ambrose said, "Where?" "Yeah. Be careful." "I will." Wesley looked at Cordelia one more time. He said, "I told you nobody was going to get past me." "Yeah, I meant it." He walked out. Cordelia stood in the front room. Ambrose picked up the second rifle from where Fletcher had left it. He carried it to the window. He stood there, looking out. Cordelia stood behind him. She said, "Ambrose." "Yes." "Do you think she is a friend?" Ambrose was quiet for a long moment. He watched the ridge. Then he said, "I do not know." Cordelia put her hand on her belly. Outside, Wesley and Fletcher rode out of the barn on their horses and moved down the fence line toward the ridge. Slow, steady, rifles across their laps. The sun was moving west. A woman on a gray horse sat still in the tree line above them. Cordelia looked at the sky. The chimney swifts were flying low again. The storm was coming faster than she had thought, and she did not know if the storm was the weather, or something else, or both. She stood at the window with Ambrose, and she watched her mountain men ride out to meet whatever was waiting for them on the ridge. And she prayed. Part 2. Wesley stopped his horse 50 feet from the tree line. Fletcher stopped beside him. The woman on the gray horse did not move. She sat there with her back straight and her hands folded on the pommel, not reaching for anything, not turning her horse, just watching them come. Wesley studied her. She was old. That was the first thing that hit him. She had been 35 years old the last time he had seen her. Standing in his mother's kitchen, yelling at his father across the table about something Wesley had been too young to understand. That was 52, 27 years ago. She was 62 now. Her hair was white. Her face was thinner than he remembered, but her eyes were the same. Sharp, gray. His mother's eyes. He said, "Aunt Prudence." She said, "Wesley." Fletcher glanced at his brother. "Wesley, kept his rifle across his lap. He said, "You want to tell me what you are doing on my ridge?" "Yes." "Now would be a fine time." She looked at him, then at Fletcher. She looked at Fletcher a long moment, because Fletcher had not been born yet when she rode out of the yard in '52. She was looking at a nephew she had never met. Fletcher shifted in the saddle. She said, "You favor your mother." Fletcher said, "Ma'am." She turned back to Wesley. "I did not come here for you. I figured. I came for the widow." Wesley did not move. His face did not change, but his hand tightened on the rifle. He said, "Explain that." She reached into her coat, slow, deliberate. She pulled out a letter. She held it up. The paper was old, not yellow yet, but worn along the folds. The kind of worn a letter got when it had been read many times by the person who carried it. She said, "This is from William Calloway. It was written to me in February of this year, 2 months before he died." Wesley did not reach for it. He said, "Fletcher." "Yeah. Right back. Tell Ambrose to bring Mrs. Calloway to the porch. Careful." Fletcher looked at him. "Wes." "Now." Fletcher turned his horse and rode back. Wesley and Prudence sat their horses in the tree line and did not speak for a long time. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere on the ridge above them, a hawk cried once. Prudence said finally, "You do not trust me." "No. Because of what happened with your father. Because you rode away 27 years ago, and I never heard from you once." "Wesley, Ma was sick for 3 years before she died. Nobody wrote to you. Nobody came. When she was buried, it was me and Ambrose and Pa in the ground. Fletcher was 6 years old. He did not even know he had an aunt. 27 years, Prudence. And now you show up on my ridge with a letter." She did not answer, because there was no answer that was going to fix that. Wesley saw her understand it. He also saw something else in her face, something he had not expected. Grief, old, settled in the way grief settled in when a person had carried it too long alone. He looked away, because he recognized that look, because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. He said more quietly, "Come down to the house." She said, "You are sure?" "No, but Cordelia will want to hear about that letter." He turned his horse. He waited. She turned her gray mare and came down out of the tree line. They rode down to the ranch side by side, not talking, not looking at each other. Fletcher was on the porch when they came through the gate. Ambrose was standing behind Cordelia. Cordelia was in the doorway. She had one hand flat against the doorframe and the other on her belly, and her eyes were on the old woman coming down the drive. Wesley swung down. He helped Prudence off her horse, because that was what a man did whether he trusted a woman or not. Prudence looked up at Cordelia on the porch. She said, "Mrs. Calloway." Cordelia said, "Yes." Prudence took 2 steps forward. She held up the letter. She said, "Your husband wrote to me." Cordelia did not move. She said, "William did not have any family." "No. But your husband and I met in Kansas City in '76. He was working a survey. I was staying with a friend. We spent an evening on a porch talking about the world. He had ideas. I had opinions. We became correspondents, on and off, for 3 years. Cordelia's hand went tight on the doorframe. She said, "He never told me." Prudence said, "He would not have. He was a private man about the people he liked. He kept them to himself, not out of shame, out of care. Wesley watched Cordelia's face because he knew what that meant to a woman. To find out her dead husband had a whole other correspondence she had never known about. But Cordelia did not flinch. She said, "Prove it." Prudence smiled a little. Not a warm smile, a tired one. She held up the letter. She said, "Read it." Cordelia came down the porch steps, slow, one hand on the rail, one hand on her belly. She reached the ground. She took the letter. She unfolded it. She read. Wesley watched her read. Her face changed. Not big, small, little tightenings around the eyes, little breaths held and let out. The paper trembled in her hand once, just once, and then she steadied it. She read to the bottom. She turned the page over. She read the back. She refolded the letter. She looked up. She said, "It is his handwriting." Prudence said, "Yes." Cordelia said, "He wrote this in February." "Yes." "He wrote to you 2 months before he died, and he told you that if anything happened to him, I should come to Wyoming." "Yes." "And find the Blackwood brothers." "Yes." Wesley was standing 5 feet away. He did not move. He did not speak, because his chest was doing something it had not done in 3 years. Cordelia looked at him. She said, "William knew about you." He said, "How?" She looked at Prudence. Prudence said, "Because I wrote to him about your family. Over the years, I wrote about your father, about your mother, about my nephews on the mountain. He knew the shape of your lives. He knew what you had lost. He knew who you were." She turned to Wesley, and when he began to suspect that Harlan Cross was hunting him, he wrote to me, and he told me that if the worst happened, his wife was to come to Wyoming, to your ranch, because he said that any son of your father's would be a man who could be trusted with what he was carrying. Wesley could not speak. He looked at the ground. He looked at the porch. He looked at Cordelia holding the letter William had written before he died. He looked at Fletcher standing there with a rifle he was slowly lowering. He looked at Ambrose standing very still behind Cordelia. Then he said, "Come inside." He said it to Prudence. She nodded. He said, "Cordelia." She looked at him. He said, "You all right?" She said, "No." He said, "I know." She said, "But keep going." He nodded. They went inside. Prudence sat at the table with a cup of coffee in front of her. She did not touch the coffee. She looked around the kitchen. Cordelia watched her, because Cordelia understood. This was the kitchen Prudence had cooked in as a young woman. This was her sister's stove, her sister's table, her sister's window looking out at the pasture. Prudence said, "The curtains are still hers." Wesley said, "Yes." She nodded. She did not say anything else about them. Cordelia opened the cedar box. She lifted out the papers. She set them on the table. Ambrose stood at the counter with his arms crossed. Fletcher was on the porch watching the road. Wesley sat across from Prudence. Prudence read the top page. She turned it over. She read the next. She stopped on the third. She said, "This is Thaddeus Whitcomb." Cordelia sat down. Slow, she said, "Say that name again." Prudence looked up. "Thaddeus Whitcomb. His name is on this page. This is a directive out of the Helena Land Office, signed by him, requesting the reclassification of a homestead in Johnson County, which is the very homestead William was surveying when he first noticed the fraud." Cordelia said, "Prudence." Prudence said, "Yeah." Cordelia said, "William had a father figure in Helena named Thaddeus Whitcomb. He never spoke of him. I never met him. I only knew he was there because of a birthday letter that came once when William was 30. And William looked at the letter and put it in a drawer and never opened it in front of me. Prudence said, "Yes." Cordelia said, "That is not a coincidence." Prudence said, "No, it is not." Wesley was watching them both. He said, "Who is Thaddeus Whitcomb?" Prudence turned to him. She said, "He is a very powerful man in the Montana Territory, and he is the father-in-law of Harlan Cross." The kitchen went silent. Cordelia put her hands flat on the table. She said very slow, "William's father figure is the father-in-law of the man trying to kill me." Prudence said, "Yes." Cordelia stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there. She did not cry. She did not speak. Wesley watched her back. He had known this woman for less than 2 days, but he had come to know the way she held herself when something inside her was breaking. She held herself very still, as if any movement at all would let the crack widen. He said quietly, "Cordelia." She said without turning, "I need a minute." He said, "Take it." She stood at the window. The chimney swifts were flying very low now. The storm was closer than it had been that morning. Behind her, the 3 brothers and Prudence sat at the table and did not speak. They gave her the room. It was one of the things Wesley had noticed about the Blackwood men. They knew how to give a person the room. After a while, she turned around. She said, "William gave me a second letter." Prudence said, "Where?" Cordelia went to the bedroom. She came back with an envelope, sealed, blue wax, William's handwriting on the front. It said only, "To be opened by Cordelia when she is safe." She said, "I have been carrying this letter for 4 months. I have not opened it." She sat down at the table. She held the envelope. Wesley said, "Are you sure you want to open it now?" She said, "I do not know if I am safe, but I have run out of places to be safer than this." She broke the seal. She opened the letter. She read. Her face changed again, the same small changes around the eyes, the mouth. She read to the bottom. She looked up at Prudence. She said, "William wrote to Thaddeus Whitcomb in March, 2 weeks before he died." Prudence said, "What did he write?" Cordelia said, "He wrote to give the man a chance." Prudence closed her eyes. Cordelia said, "William says here that he still loved Thaddeus, even after he cut him off 5 years ago, when he began to suspect the fraud. He says here that Thaddeus took him in when he was 14, after his own father died. That Thaddeus paid for his schooling. That Thaddeus was the reason William became a surveyor at all." She turned the letter over. She said, "William says that he wanted to believe Thaddeus did not know, that the fraud was Harlan's alone, and so he wrote to Thaddeus 2 weeks before he died. He told him what he had found. He told him he was going to the federal office. He gave Thaddeus one chance to come, to choose, to help." She looked up. She said, "William says he did not know if the letter ever reached him, or if it did, whether Thaddeus opened it. But if he did, and if he chose right, then he would come when I needed him." The kitchen was very still. Prudence said quietly, "William was a better man than most." Cordelia said, "Yes, he was." Wesley said, "Is Thaddeus Whitcomb coming?" Cordelia said, "I do not know." Wesley said, Then we plan for both. Ambrose said from the counter, "Yeah." Fletcher came in from the porch. He said, "Wes, there is a rider on the south trail, alone, coming up slow." Wesley stood up. He walked to the window. He looked. Then he said, "That is not one of Cross's men." Fletcher said, "How do you know?" "Because I know that horse. That is Jed Brannigan's boy." He turned to the room. He said, "The marshal sent word ahead." The boy was 15 years old. He came up the drive at a lope, reined in at the gate, called out. Wesley waved him through. The boy swung down and pulled the folded paper from his coat. He said, "Mr. Blackwood, Marshal Graves says to tell you he got the message. He is riding tonight. He will be here tomorrow evening if the weather holds. He said if it does not hold, he will still be here, just later." Wesley took the paper. He read it. He looked at the boy. He said, "Anything else?" The boy hesitated. He said, "My pa said to tell you that there are men down in Buffalo asking about a widow. 4 of them. They are staying at the boarding house on Main. They arrived this morning." Wesley folded the paper. He said, "How many rifles do you count?" The boy said, 2 on their saddles, 1 on each. But my pa said their coats sat heavy, so more. Wesley nodded. He said, "You ride straight back. You do not stop. You do not tell anybody you were here. If they see you on the road, you say you were fishing at Willow Creek." The boy said, "Yes, sir." Wesley reached into his pocket. He gave the boy a silver dollar. The boy took it, nodded, swung up, turned his horse, and was gone at a canter down the drive. Wesley came back into the kitchen. He set the paper on the table. He said, "Marshall is 1 day out. Cross's men are 4 hours out. And there is a storm coming tonight that will slow both." Prudence said, "So we hold this house for 1 more day." Wesley said, "Yes." Cordelia said, "I am sorry." Wesley turned to her. "For what?" "For bringing this to your door." Wesley said, "Cordelia." "Yeah." "Stop apologizing for being in danger. The people who made you dangerous are the ones who should be apologizing." Ambrose almost smiled. Fletcher did smile. Cordelia looked down at her hands. She said, "All right." That afternoon, the sky turned the color of old iron. The wind came down off the bighorns in long, slow waves. The pines bent. The horses in the pasture moved to the tree line and stood together. Fletcher and Ambrose got the last of the hay into the barn. Wesley carried the wagon around to the back of the house where it could not be seen from the trail. Prudence helped Cordelia put clean sheets on a second bed, because Prudence would need a place to sleep too. They worked without much talking. Cordelia found herself standing in the hallway at one point. Prudence came out of the second bedroom. She stopped. She looked at Cordelia. She said, "May I ask you something?" Cordelia said, "Yes." Prudence said, "When was the last time you slept a full night?" Cordelia thought about it. She could not remember. She said, "March." Prudence said, "Get in bed." Cordelia said, "There is too much to do." Prudence said, "There are 3 grown men and a 62-year-old woman in this house. Between the 4 of us, we can put curtains up and stack firewood without your help. Get in bed." Cordelia opened her mouth, then closed it, because Prudence had the tone, the one Cordelia's own mother had used when she was done arguing. Cordelia went to bed. She lay down on the quilt with her boots still on. She was asleep in 2 minutes. When she woke up, the storm had started. Rain hammered the roof. Wind rattled the windows. The room was dark. Someone had covered her with a blanket. Her boots had been taken off, set neatly by the door. She had slept for 4 hours. She sat up. She put her boots back on. She went out to the kitchen. The lamps were lit. The stove was warm. Ambrose was at the stove. Prudence was at the table with a stack of William's papers. She was sorting them, making a system. Fletcher was cleaning a rifle by the fire. Wesley was at the window, watching the storm. He turned when she came in. He said, "You slept?" "Yes." "Good." She sat down at the table. Prudence poured her coffee. Cordelia said, "How is the storm?" Wesley said, "Bad and getting worse." Fletcher said, "You called it right, ma'am." Cordelia said, "It is Cordelia." Fletcher smiled. "Yes, ma'am." Ambrose brought a bowl to the table. He said, "Stew, eat." She ate. The stew was good. Everything Ambrose cooked was good. She said, "Ambrose." He looked at her. She said, "How did you learn?" He said, "Ma taught me before she died. Then I taught myself the rest." He turned back to the stove, but he said over his shoulder, "You are picking up the cornbread fast." Cordelia felt something warm move under her sternum, because that was the closest thing to a compliment Ambrose Blackwood had ever handed to anybody, and she knew it. She said, "Thank you." He grunted. Fletcher grinned at her from the fire. She grinned back. Wesley was watching them from the window. His face did not change much, but something in his eyes was different from the day before. He said, "Cordelia." "Yes." "I want to show you something." She stood up. He led her down the hall. He opened a door she had not been through. It was a small room, a room off the kitchen. It had a workbench along one wall, tools hanging above it, and a rocking chair by the window, and a shelf. On the shelf were 3 carved wooden horses. Wesley picked one up. He said, "My mother made these for me and Ambrose and Fletcher when we were small. She carved the horses. My father made the shelf." Cordelia touched one. It was worn smooth from handling. She said, "They are beautiful." He said, "The rocking chair was hers too. She rocked all 3 of us in it." Cordelia looked at the chair. She said, "Wesley, why are you showing me this?" He was quiet. Then he said, "Because I would like you to bring your baby into this room when she comes. I would like you to sit in that chair and rock her, and put one of these horses on the shelf beside these 3, whichever horse feels right to you, and I would like the shelf to have 4 horses on it." Cordelia could not speak. He said, "I know that is presumptuous. I know we have known each other 3 days." She said, "Wesley." He said, "But I am telling you what I want, so that you know, when you make your choices next week, and the week after, and a month from now, what is being offered to you." She looked at him. He was standing very still. His hands were at his sides. His eyes were on the shelf, not on her. She said, "Wesley Blackwood." He looked at her. She said, "You are a very strange man." He almost smiled. He said, "So I have been told." She turned and walked back to the kitchen, because if she stayed one more second, she was going to cry. And she was not ready to cry in front of him. That night, the storm broke a window in the barn. Fletcher went out to nail a board over it. Ambrose went with him because a man did not fix a window in a storm alone. Wesley stayed at the front door with a rifle. Prudence stayed at the table with Cordelia. Cordelia was folding William's papers into piles. Prudence watched her hands. She said, "You are calmer than you should be." Cordelia said, "I have been terrified for 4 months. I have used it up." Prudence said, "That is not how fear works." Cordelia looked up. Prudence said, "Fear does not run out. It just goes quiet for a while. Then it comes back, usually when you have your guard down." Cordelia said, "You sound like a woman who knows." Prudence said, "I do." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you want to know why I left?" Cordelia said, "Yes." Prudence took a breath. She said, "Your Wesley's father was a hard man, not cruel but hard, and I was a young woman with opinions, which he did not like. My sister loved him, and I loved my sister, so I bit my tongue for 6 years, until the night he told me that my opinions were not welcome under his roof." She looked at her hand. She said, "I rode out that night. I was 35. I thought I would come back in a year, when we had both cooled off." Cordelia waited. Prudence said, "I did not come back." Cordelia said, "Why?" Prudence said, "Because pride is a very stubborn thing, and by the time I was ready to swallow mine, my sister was 3 years dead." Cordelia set the papers down. She said, "Prudence." Prudence said, I know, and I have thought about it every day for 27 years. Cordelia said, "Then why now?" Prudence said, "Because William wrote to me, and he said that his wife was going to need help, that he was afraid he was going to die, and that if he did, I should watch. And if the day came when you were coming through Wyoming, I should write to my nephews, whether they wanted me or not, and offer what I had." She looked at Cordelia. She said, "Your husband was a good man. He gave me my one chance to come home, even though he did not owe me anything." Cordelia said, "That was William." Prudence said, "Yes." They sat there. The wind howled, the rain came down. Somewhere out at the barn, Ambrose and Fletcher hammered a board over the broken window. Prudence said, "May I tell you one more thing?" Cordelia said, "Yes." Prudence said, "William wrote about you a great deal. In the letters, he said you were the reason he had the courage to do what he was doing. He said you were his center. He said you were his best decision." Cordelia stopped breathing. Prudence said, "He wanted you to know that. Whenever you were ready, he asked me to tell you." Cordelia put both hands over her face. She cried, silent, bone deep, the kind of crying she had been holding back since April, since the room where William had died with his hand in hers, since she had gotten on the wagon in Missouri with the cedar box and the $47 and the promise she was not sure she could keep. She cried into her hand. Prudence sat there with her. Prudence did not touch her, because Prudence understood that the touching would come later, and what Cordelia needed right now was room and a witness. Cordelia cried for a long time. When she was done, she wiped her face with her sleeve. She said, "I have not cried like that in 4 months." Prudence said, "I know." Cordelia said, "Thank you." Prudence said, "You are welcome." Wesley was at the front door. He had heard. He did not come in. He gave her the room, which was somehow the exact right thing. The storm blew itself out at sunrise. Ambrose was on the porch with coffee. Fletcher was in the barn with the horses. Wesley was sitting at the kitchen table with his rifle across his knees. He had not slept. Cordelia came into the kitchen. She sat down across from him. He poured her coffee. She said, "Wesley." He said, "Yes." She said, "How much time do we have?" He said, "Cross's men rode into Buffalo yesterday morning. They will be moving today. The storm slowed them, but not by more than a few hours. I figure by midday they will be on the trail. By late afternoon, sundown at the outside, they will find this ranch." He looked at her. He said, "The marshal will not be here until tonight." She said, "So there is a window." He said, "Yes." She said, "Between when Cross's men arrive and when the marshal arrives, how long?" He said, 2 hours, maybe 3, maybe less. She said, "All right." He said, "All right." She said, "Wesley." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to know your plan." He said, "I do not have a full one." She said, "Tell me the part you have." He said, "I am going down to the lower meadow at 2 o'clock. I am going to send a message down the trail this morning to Cross's man on the ridge. I am going to tell him I want to negotiate. I have looked in the box. I know what is in it. I have a proposal." Cordelia said, "Which is?" Wesley said, "Which is that I want him to bring Cross himself, not his men. Cross alone or Cross with one man, to the meadow at 2. Cordelia said, "You are going to draw him out." Wesley said, "Yes." Cordelia said, "Alone." Wesley said, "Yes." Cordelia said, "No." Wesley looked at her. She said, "I mean, no, I do not agree." He said, "Cordelia." She said, "You are going to sit in a meadow alone with a man who has already tried to kill me once because you think you can negotiate." He said, "I am not going to negotiate. I am going to buy us time until the marshal gets here." She said, "By putting yourself in that meadow." He said, "Yes." She said, "No." He said, "Cordelia." She said, "Wesley Blackwood, listen to me." He listened. She said, "You are the only person in this house who has looked me in the eye since William died and treated me like I was still a person. Not a widow, not a problem, not a burden, a person. And I'm not going to sit in this kitchen while you ride down to a meadow to trade your life for 2 hours of my time." He said, "That is not what I am doing." She said, "That is exactly what you are doing." He said, "I have brother." She said, "Your brothers are as terrified of losing you as I am." He went still. She said, "Do not pretend you did not know that." He said, "I did not think of it in those words." She said, "Then think of it now." He looked at his coffee. She said, "There is another way." He said, "I am listening." She said, "Bring Cross here." He said, "To the ranch." She said, "Yes." He said, "Cordelia." She said, "Hear me out." He said, "All right." She said, "You go down to the meadow. You meet the scout. You tell him you want to negotiate. But you tell him the negotiation happens here, at the ranch, at sundown. Cross comes, one man, no more. He gets the box, he walks out. Nobody dies." She looked at him. She said, "And when he comes to the ranch, Ambrose and Fletcher and Prudence and I are here, in the house, with rifles. and the marshal is 1 hour out, and we do not give Cross the box. We hold him until the marshal arrives. Wesley thought about it. He said, "That is a very risky plan." She said, "The one where you sit in a meadow alone is riskier." He said, "For me." She said, "That is my point." He looked at her a long time. He said, "You have gotten bold, Mrs. Calloway." She said, "I got tired of being afraid, Mr. Blackwood." He almost smiled. He said, "All right." She said, "All right." Ambrose came in from the porch. He had heard. He said, "The plan works better with 4 rifles inside than with 1 man in a meadow." Wesley looked at him. Ambrose said, "I am with her." Fletcher came in from the barn. He said, "What are we doing?" Ambrose said, "Cordelia has a plan." Fletcher said, "Do we like it?" Ambrose said, "Yes." Fletcher said, "Then I like it." Prudence came out of the second bedroom. She said, "What did I miss?" Cordelia said, "We are bringing Harlan Cross to this house at sundown." Prudence said, "Excellent." She sat down at the table. She said, "I will make lunch." Wesley looked around the kitchen, at his brothers, at his aunt, at the widow who had walked into his life 3 days ago on her hands and knees in the dirt, and now she was giving him orders, and they were good orders. He said, "All right." He stood up. He picked up his rifle. He looked at Cordelia. He said, "I am going down to the meadow to leave the message with the scout. I will be back in 2 hours. If I am not back in 3. Ambrose knows what to do." Cordelia said, "You will be back in 2. Wesley said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Cordelia." He said, "Yes, Cordelia." He walked out. Ambrose watched him go, then he turned to Cordelia. He said, "That was well done." She said, "Was it?" He said, "He would have died out there, alone, for you, for Voss. He would have found a way to do it right and to make it look necessary, and none of us would have been able to stop him." He looked at her. He said, "You stopped him." She said, "I told him no." He said, "Nobody has told Wesley no in 3 years." She said, "Well, it was time." Ambrose almost smiled. He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Cordelia." He said, "Yes, Cordelia." Prudence poured coffee. Fletcher started laying out rifles on the kitchen table. Ambrose went to the door and looked out at the trail Wesley was riding down. Cordelia stood at the window. She put a hand on her belly. She said quietly, "William, if you can hear me, I am doing my best." The baby moved just a nudge, right below her ribs, which felt like an answer. Wesley came back in 1 hour and 45 minutes. He rode into the yard at a canter, swung down, handed the reins to Fletcher, came up the porch steps. He walked into the kitchen. He said, "The message is sent. Scout took it. He will ride to Cross now. Cross will be here at sundown." Cordelia said, "How many men?" Wesley said, "The scout said 1. Cross wants to keep it small." Cordelia said, "You believe him?" Wesley said, "I believe the scout. I do not believe Cross." Ambrose said, "So we plan for 1 on the porch, and more in the tree line." Wesley said, "Yes." Cordelia said, "How many is more?" Wesley said, 3 or 4. Cordelia said, "All right." Wesley said, "All right." They spent the afternoon getting ready. Ambrose cleaned and loaded every rifle in the house, 4 total. He laid them in specific places. One at the front window, one at the back door, one in the kitchen, one at the top of the stairs. Fletcher walked the property. He knew every rock and tree on this ranch. He picked the spots where a man might hide. He memorized them. Prudence made a large pot of stew that would keep hot on the stove. Because a man could not shoot straight if he was hungry, and if the marshal arrived late, they were going to need to eat. Wesley sat with Cordelia at the kitchen table. He said, "I want you in the back bedroom when Cross comes." She said, "I want to be in the kitchen." He said, "Cordelia." She said, "Wesley." He said, "You are 8 months pregnant." She said, "I am aware." He said, "If something goes wrong, if a bullet comes through a window." She said, "Then I want to be where I can see it coming." He was quiet. Then he said, "All right, but you sit in the corner behind the stove, where the wall is thickest, and you have a rifle, and if it comes to it, you use it." She said, "I will." He said, "I know." She said, "Wesley." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to tell you something before Cross comes." He said, "All right." She reached into her pocket. She took out something small. She set it on the table between them. It was a gold ring, thin, worn, old. She said, "This was William's mother's. She gave it to me when we got engaged." Wesley looked at it. She said, "There are $47 in the cedar box, hidden in the bottom under a false panel. William put them there, just in case. And this ring is mine, and I want you to take both." Wesley said, "Cordelia." She said, "Not because I am going to die, but because if something goes wrong tonight, and I do not make it, I want you to promise me you will take the baby and you will use the money to get her to Harriet in Billings, and you will give Harriet this ring, and you will tell her that her sister loved her very much and that this baby is her baby now." Wesley said, "Cordelia." She said, "Wesley, please." He looked at the ring. He looked at her. She looked back. He picked up the ring. He put it in his pocket. He said, "I promise." She said, "Thank you." He said, "But nothing is going to go wrong." She said, "I know." He said, "Because I made a promise on the trail 2 days ago that nobody was going to get past me, and I am going to keep it." She said, "I know." He said, "Cordelia." She said, "Yes." He said, "Say my name back to me." She said, "Wesley Blackwood." He said, "That is right." He stood up. He went to the front room. Cordelia sat at the table. She put a hand on her belly. The baby moved. Not a nudge this time. A kick. A hard one. Cordelia inhaled sharp, because something inside her had shifted. She stood up slowly. Prudence came into the kitchen. She looked at Cordelia. She said, "What?" Cordelia said, "Prudence." Prudence said, "What?" Cordelia said, "I think it is starting." Prudence went to her side. She said, "How long?" Cordelia said, "Not long, just a few minutes." Prudence said, "Wesley." Wesley came from the front room. Prudence said, "The baby is coming." Wesley said, "When?" Prudence said, "Now or soon. I cannot tell yet." Wesley said, "How long is soon?" Prudence said, "Hours, maybe a day. First real contractions can go for a long time before the actual work starts, but it has started." Wesley looked at Cordelia. Cordelia looked at Wesley. Fletcher came in from the porch. He said, "Wes, riders on the north ridge." Wesley said, "How many?" Fletcher said, I count 6. Wesley said, Cross said 1. Fletcher said, Cross lied. Wesley picked up his rifle. He said, Ambrose. Ambrose was already at the front window. He said, I see them. Wesley said, Cordelia goes upstairs with Prudence, right now. Cordelia said, Wesley. Wesley said, Cordelia, the baby is coming, and Cross is coming, and you are going upstairs, and Prudence is going with you. And when the marshal gets here, we will bring you back down. But right now, you are going upstairs. Please. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, all right. She turned to Prudence. Prudence took her arm. They went up the stairs. At the top, Cordelia looked back. Wesley was standing in the front room with his rifle. Ambrose was at the window. Fletcher was moving to the back door. 3 brothers, 3 rifles, 1 woman upstairs about to have a baby, 6 men coming up the ridge, and a federal marshal an hour away. Cordelia put her hand on her belly. The baby kicked again, hard. Prudence closed the bedroom door behind them. She said, get on the bed. Cordelia got on the bed. Downstairs, Wesley Blackwood walked out onto the porch. Alone, with his rifle. Ready. Because that was what the man did when he had made a promise. And Cordelia Calloway watched the light through the 2nd-story window, and she prayed, and the baby moved inside her. And the storm, the other storm, the one that had nothing to do with weather, rolled in off the mountain, and the light on the ridge caught 6 rifles at once, and Wesley Blackwood stood on his porch and waited. Part 3. 6 riders on the ridge. Wesley counted them again to be sure. 6. Cross had said 1. Cross had lied. Wesley stood on his porch with his rifle across his chest and watched them come down. Slow, deliberate. The way men rode when they wanted you to see them coming. The lead rider was Harlan Cross himself. Wesley knew him from a photograph Cordelia had pulled from the cedar box the day before. Broad-shouldered, well-dressed, a dark coat, a silver watch chain across his vest that caught the sundown light. Behind him were 5 hired men, rifles, sidearms, the kind of men who worked for whoever paid the most. Ambrose spoke from the window inside the front room. He said quiet 6. Wesley said without turning, yes. Ambrose said, that is more than we counted for. Wesley said yes. Ambrose said Wes. Wesley said yeah. Ambrose said hold your temper. Wesley almost smiled, because Ambrose had said that to him since they were boys. Wesley said, I always do. Ambrose said, no, you do not. Fletcher spoke from the back door. He said, I have the rear covered. Nobody comes through this door alive. Wesley said, good. The riders stopped 50 feet from the porch. Cross swung down. The other 5 stayed mounted. Cross walked forward, alone. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked up at Wesley. He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. He said, Mr. Blackwood. Wesley said, Mr. Cross. Cross said, I appreciate the invitation. Wesley said, you brought company. Cross said, for my safety. Wesley said, I said 1. Cross said, yes. He looked at his men. He looked back at Wesley. He said, but we are here to negotiate, and I find that negotiations go better when I am not concerned about being outnumbered. Wesley said, you are not outnumbered. Cross said, not yet. Wesley said, You will not be later either. Cross smiled again. He said, I hope that is true. Wesley did not smile. He said, Say what you came to say. Cross said, You have the widow. Wesley said, I have a guest. Cross said, You have the box. Wesley said, I have a lot of boxes. Cross said, Mr. Blackwood. Wesley said, Mr. Cross. Cross said, I did not ride 10 hours to be clever with you. Wesley said, Then do not be. Cross took a breath. He said, I want the papers. Wesley said, And what do I get? Cross said, $500, and my promise that the widow leaves this territory alive. Wesley said, You already tampered with her wagon. Cross said, That was a mistake by one of my men. Wesley said, Which one? Cross said, Does it matter? Wesley said, Yes. Cross said, Why? Wesley said, Because I would like to know his name. Cross said, For what? Wesley said, For when I speak to him later. Cross's jaw tightened, just slightly. He said, Mr. Blackwood, I am offering you $500, which is more money than this ranch has seen in 5 years. Take the offer. Give me the box. Everyone walks away. Wesley said no. Cross said no is not a negotiation. Wesley said, Then this is not a negotiation. Cross looked at him a long moment. Then he said, You understand what happens if you refuse. Wesley said, I understand what happens if I accept. Cross said, What happens if you accept? Wesley said, You take the box, you ride out. You come back in 6 months and burn this ranch to the ground with me and my brothers inside it, because you cannot leave a witness like me alive. Cross did not respond, which was an answer. Wesley said, I have thought about it, Mr. Cross. I have thought about it since yesterday morning. Any way I turn this thing over, any angle I look at it from, it ends the same way. You do not leave people alive who can put you in a federal courtroom. Cross said, You could be wrong about me. Wesley said, I could be, but I am not. Cross said, So what is your offer? Wesley said, My offer is that you get on that horse. You ride down my drive. You go back to Buffalo. You do not come near this ranch or this widow or this baby again. And I will not send my brother down to Buffalo tonight to shoot you in your sleep. Cross said, That is a threat. Wesley said, That is a promise. Cross said, You cannot back that up. Wesley said, Ambrose. Ambrose spoke from the window. He said, Mr. Cross, I have your left eye in my sights. Have had it for 4 minutes. Would you like me to demonstrate? Cross went very still. He said, That will not be necessary. Wesley said, Fletcher. Fletcher spoke from the back of the house. His voice carried. He said, Mr. Cross, your man on the far right, the one with the tan hat, he has been leaning toward his rifle for 2 minutes. If he touches it, he is dead. Please tell him. Cross turned his head toward the men behind him. He said, Ease down. The man in the tan hat eased down. Cross turned back to Wesley. He said, You have made your point. Wesley said, I have made half of it. Cross said, What is the other half? Wesley said, The federal deputy marshal will be here within the hour. Cross said, You are bluffing. Wesley said, Ask me again when he gets here. Cross's face changed very small, but Wesley saw it. The confidence flickered, just for a moment. Then it came back. Cross said, "Mr. Blackwood, let me be direct. I have 5 armed men. You have 3 rifles that I can see. I do not know if there is a marshal. I know there is a widow. I know there is a box, and I know that my patience is not unlimited." Wesley said, "Neither is mine." Cross said, "Then let us not test each other." Wesley said, "You already tested me when you rode up with 6 men after I said 1. Cross said, "That was a precaution." Wesley said, "That was a lie." Cross said, "Mr. Blackwood." Wesley said, "Mr. Cross." Cross said, "I am going to give you 60 seconds. Wesley said, "For what?" Cross said, "To bring the box out, or my men come inside and take it." Wesley said, "They will not make it to the porch." Cross said, "Some of them will." Wesley said, "Not enough." Cross said, "Enough." They looked at each other. Sundown was hitting the tops of the pines. The light was gold and long. Somewhere upstairs, Cordelia was in labor. Somewhere down the trail, Marshal Aldous Graves was riding hard. Wesley did not know how far away the marshal was. Not close enough. That much he knew. He said, "Mr. Cross." Cross said, "Yes." Wesley said, "There is a third thing you do not know." Cross said, "What?" Wesley said, "There is a letter." Cross said, "What letter?" Wesley said, "A letter from William Calloway to his father-in-law, Thaddeus Whitcomb, in Helena, written 2 weeks before William died." Cross's face did not change, but something in his shoulders did. He said, "Whitcomb is my father-in-law." Wesley said, "I know." Cross said, "What about the letter?" Wesley said, "William gave Thaddeus a chance. 2 weeks before he died. He told him everything. He told him what you were doing. He said that if Thaddeus opened the letter and chose right, he was to come when the widow was in trouble." Cross was very still now. He said, "Thaddeus never received such a letter." Wesley said, "Are you sure?" Cross said, "Yes." Wesley said, "How can you be sure?" Cross did not answer, because he could not be sure, because he had not been standing next to Thaddeus every day for the last 5 months, because his father-in-law was in Helena, 200 miles from Buffalo, and could have received a letter without Cross ever knowing. Cross said, "Even if Thaddeus received the letter, he would side with me." Wesley said, "Would he?" Cross said, "Yeah." Wesley said, "Even after William, who he raised, who he sent to school, who he loved, reached out one last time before he died." Cross said, "You are trying to shake me." Wesley said, "Yes." Cross said, "It is not working." Wesley said, "Is it not?" Cross opened his mouth, then closed it, because he did not have an answer. Then behind Cross, very faint, coming up the drive, hoofbeats fast, multiple riders. Cross turned, his men turned. Wesley did not move, because he already knew. He said, "Quiet, Ambrose." Ambrose said, "Yes." Wesley said, "Keep your eye on the tan hat." Ambrose said, "Yes." The riders came around the bend, 8 of them. At the head of the group was a lean man in his 60s, white hair, neat beard, a dark coat. He rode a tall bay. He rode like a man who had spent his youth in the saddle and then spent his later years behind a desk and had never quite decided which he preferred. Behind him were 7 men, Federal marshals, badges on their coats, rifles across their saddles. The kind of men a territorial commissioner brought with him when he meant business. Cross went white. He said, "Thaddeus." Thaddeus Whitcomb reined in at the gate. He looked at Cross. He looked at Wesley. He looked at the porch. He said, "Mr. Blackwood." Wesley said, "Sir." Thaddeus said, "May I come up?" Wesley said, "You alone, not your escort, not yet." Thaddeus said, "That is fair." He swung down. He walked through this gate. He walked past Cross without looking at him. He came up the porch steps. He stopped in front of Wesley. He looked at Wesley a long moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Calloway is in this house." Wesley said, "Yes." Thaddeus said, "Is she well?" Wesley said, "She is in labor." Thaddeus closed his eyes. Just for a second, he said, "Then may God be with her." Wesley said, "You got the letter?" Thaddeus said, "Yeah." Wesley said, "When?" Thaddeus said, "The day after William died. It came by courier. I sat with it for a week before I opened it." Wesley said, "Why?" Thaddeus said, "Because I was afraid of what was inside." Wesley said, "And when you opened it?" Thaddeus said, "I sat with it for another week." Wesley said, "And then?" Thaddeus said, "And then I began to investigate my own son-in-law." Wesley said, "Quietly." Thaddeus said, "Very quietly." He looked past Wesley into the house. He said, "William was my son, not by blood, but by every measure that matters. His father died when he was 14. He came to my house. I raised him. I sent him to school. I gave him his first survey job. And when he cut me off 5 years ago, I did not know why." He looked at Wesley. He said, "Now I know why." Wesley said, "Yes, sir." Thaddeus said, "May I go inside and speak to Mrs. Calloway?" Wesley said, "No, sir." Thaddeus said, "Why not?" Wesley said, "Because she is in labor, and she does not know you, and she is not going to know you today, not while she is bringing William's child into the world. If she wants to meet you tomorrow, she will." Thaddeus said, "That is fair." Wesley said, "There is a man in your escort who is a doctor." Thaddeus said, "How did you know?" Wesley said, "Because that is what I would have brought." Thaddeus said, "I brought 2. Wesley said, "Send them in." Thaddeus said, "Yeah." He turned. He waved to his escort. 2 men swung down and pulled medical bags from their saddlebags. They came up the porch steps. Wesley said to them, "Upstairs. My aunt is with her. Her name is Prudence. Do not scare her." The doctors nodded. They went inside. Wesley turned back to Thaddeus. He said, "Now about Harlan Cross." Thaddeus turned toward the yard. He looked at his son-in-law. He said, "Harlan." Cross said, "Sir." Thaddeus said, "You will tell your men to lay down their rifles. Everyone, now." Cross said, "Sir, there has been a misunderstanding." Thaddeus said, "I do not think there has been." Cross said, "Thaddeus." Thaddeus said, "Do not use my first name." Cross said, "Please listen." Thaddeus said, "I read the letter Harlan from William. I have read it more times than I can count. I have not slept a full night since. Do you know what it says?" Cross said, "Sir." Thaddeus said, "It says that you have been forging surveys with dead men's names. It says that you have been stealing land from homesteaders. It says that when William came to you and asked you to stop, you told him that his sentimentality was going to be a problem. Cross said, William was mistaken. Thaddeus said, William was never mistaken about a thing in his life. Cross said, Sir. Thaddeus said, Tell your men to lay down their rifles, or my escort will do it for them. Cross looked at his men. He looked at the 7 federal marshals behind Thaddeus. Federal, not local. Federal marshals had authority in every county. Cross said, Down. His 5 men laid down their rifles. The federal marshals moved forward. They collected the rifles. They bound the men's hands. Cross stood in the yard. Alone there. Thaddeus walked back down the porch steps. He walked toward Cross. He stopped 6 feet away. He said, Harlan. Cross said, Sir. Thaddeus said, My daughter loved you. Cross said, She still does. Thaddeus said, She will not when she learns what you have done. Cross said, Sir. Thaddeus said, You will surrender yourself to federal custody. You will be transported to Helena for trial. You will testify to everything you know. You will name every accomplice you have. Every man who took your money. Every clerk who signed a forged document. Cross said, And in exchange. Thaddeus said, In exchange, I will speak on my daughter's behalf at your sentencing. That is all I can offer you. That is all you deserve. Cross said, That is not enough. Thaddeus said, It is more than William got. Cross went silent. 2 federal marshals came forward. They took him. They bound his hands. They put him in the yard with the other 5. Thaddeus turned back to Wesley. He said, Mr. Blackwood. Wesley said, Sir. Thaddeus said, Thank you. Wesley said, For what? Thaddeus said, For standing on this porch when you did not have to. Wesley said, It is what my father would have done. Thaddeus said, Then your father was a good man. Wesley said, He was. Thaddeus said, I would like to sit on this porch until Mrs. Calloway is safely delivered, if that is acceptable to you. Wesley said, It is. Thaddeus said, May I ask you one more thing? Wesley said, Yes. Thaddeus said, When William's child is born, would you please tell Mrs. Calloway that she is welcome in my home, that the Whitcomb name is behind her, that whatever she needs, she has. Wesley said, I will tell her. Thaddeus said, Thank you. He sat down in the rocker on the porch. He put his hands on his knees. He looked out at the yard where his son-in-law sat bound. He did not cry, but his shoulders were very tired. Upstairs, Cordelia was in the middle of the worst pain of her life. Prudence held one of her hands. One of the doctors held the other. The second doctor was at the foot of the bed. He had washed his hands. He had rolled up his sleeves. He was calm. He said, Mrs. Calloway. Cordelia said, Yes. He said, The baby is breech. Cordelia said, What? He said, The baby is turned around. I need to turn her before she comes. Do you understand what I am saying? Cordelia said, Yeah. He said, It is going to hurt. Cordelia said, All right. He said, It has to happen now. Cordelia said, All right. Prudence said, Squeeze my hand as hard as you need to. Cordelia squeezed her hand. The doctor worked. Cordelia cried out. She could not help it. Downstairs, Wesley heard it. He closed his eyes, just for a second. Fletcher came out to the porch. He stood next to his brother. He said, "Wes." Wesley said, "Yeah." Fletcher said, "She is going to be all right." Wesley said, "I know." Fletcher said, "The baby is going to be all right." Wesley said, "I know." Fletcher said, "Wes." Wesley said, "Yeah." Fletcher said, "It is all right to sit down." Wesley did not sit down, but something in his shoulders eased. He said, "Fletcher." Fletcher said, "Yeah." Wesley said, "You did good today." Fletcher said, "So did you." They stood on the porch. Ambrose came out. He said, "Wes." Wesley said, "Yeah." Ambrose said, "Marshal Graves is coming up the drive." Wesley turned. The marshal came around the bend at a hard trot, alone, dust on his coat, sweat on his horse. He reined in at the gate. He looked at the yard. He looked at the bound men. He looked at the federal marshals. He looked at Thaddeus Whitcomb on the porch. He said, "Well." Wesley said, "Aldous." Aldous said, "Wesley." He swung down. He walked up the porch steps. He looked at the Wesley. He said, "I ran my horse into the ground for this." Wesley said, "You did what you could." Aldous said, "Where is Mrs. Calloway?" Wesley said, "She is upstairs." Aldous said, "In labor." Wesley said, "Yes." Aldous said, "The baby." Wesley said, "The baby is coming." Aldous said, "Any complications?" Wesley said, "Breach, the doctors are working." Aldous said, "There are doctors." Wesley said, "Two." Aldous said, "You had doctors on hand." Wesley said, "I did not have them on hand." He did. Aldous looked at Thaddeus. Thaddeus stood up. He said, "Marshal." Aldous said, "Sir." Thaddeus said, "I am Thaddeus Whitcomb. I am here to place my son-in-law Harlan Cross into federal custody and to provide testimony against him and his associates." Aldous said, "You are turning in your own son-in-law." Thaddeus said, "I am." Aldous was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Sir, I have been a federal marshal for 18 years. I have never seen a man do what you are doing tonight." Thaddeus said, "Then let me be the first." Aldous nodded. He said, "All right." He turned to Wesley. He said, "I have paperwork." Wesley said, "There is coffee in the kitchen." Aldous said, "God bless you." He went inside. Wesley stood on the porch. Fletcher stood next to him. Ambrose stood on the other side. Thaddeus sat back down. Above them, Cordelia cried out again. Longer, sharper. Then she stopped. Wesley stopped breathing. Then he heard something else. A different sound. Thin, high, insistent. A baby crying. Wesley closed his eyes. He put a hand on the porch rail. He held on. Fletcher started crying. Just quiet. Ambrose put a hand on Fletcher's shoulder. Then Ambrose put a hand on Wesley's shoulder. Neither brother spoke, because there was nothing to say. Prudence came to the top of the stairs. She called down. She said, "Wesley." Wesley walked to the bottom of the stairs. He looked up. Prudence was smiling, which was a thing Wesley had not seen her do in 27 years. She said, "A girl. She is small, she is healthy. Cordelia is well. She is asking for you." Wesley said, She's asking for me. Prudence said, yes. Wesley climbed the stairs. He walked down the hall. The bedroom door was open. The doctors were washing their hands at the basin. Cordelia was in the bed. She was pale. She was tired. She was alive. She was holding a baby wrapped in a quilt. She looked up when he came in. She said, Wesley. He said, Cordelia. She said, come here. He came to the bed. He sat on the edge of it. He looked at the baby. The baby had dark hair. The baby had a very serious expression. The baby was very small. Cordelia said, this is Margaret. Wesley could not speak. She said, Margaret Beatrice Calloway, if that is all right. Wesley said, Cordelia. She said, for your wife and for my daughter Beatrice, who did not stay long enough, and for Maggie, who will. Wesley said, Cordelia. She said, say yes or no. He said, yes. She said, all right. She held the baby out. She said, hold her. He said, I do not. She said, Wesley Blackwood, hold your daughter. He took the baby. He held her. He did not cry, except he did, just a little, just enough that Cordelia reached up and touched his face. She said, it is all right. He said, I know. She said, it is all right to have a family again. He said, I know. She said, say it back to me. He said, it is all right. She said, good. She closed her eyes. She said, I am going to sleep now. He said, yes. She said, stay in this chair. He said, yes. She said, do not leave. He said, I will not. She slept. Wesley sat in the chair beside the bed. He held the baby. He watched Cordelia sleep. He did not move for a long time. Downstairs, Aldous Graves filled out paperwork. Ambrose brought him coffee. Fletcher walked out to the yard and stood next to the federal marshals and did not speak. Thaddeus Whitcomb sat on the porch. Prudence Blackwood came and sat next to him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Prudence said quietly, you are Thaddeus. He turned, he looked at her. He said, yes. She said, William wrote to me about you. He said, did he? She said, he said that you were the best man he had ever known. He said that he loved you. He said that he cut you off because he was trying to protect you from what he was going to have to do. Thaddeus's eyes filled. He did not cry, but they filled. He said, that is a great deal to hear. Prudence said, William was very careful with what he said, which meant everything he did say. He meant. Thaddeus said, thank you. Prudence said, you are welcome. They sat on the porch. Cross was taken away in a wagon. The federal marshals rode off with him. Sundown became dark. Ambrose brought lanterns. The doctors came downstairs. They said Cordelia was well. They said the baby was well. They said Cordelia needed to sleep. And so did the baby. And so did all of them. They left with the marshal. The marshal shook Wesley's hand at the door. Aldous said, I will need a full statement tomorrow. Wesley said, you will have it. Aldous said, you did good, Wesley. Wesley said, Cordelia did good. Aldous said, yes, she did. He rode off. The ranch was quiet. Wesley came back into the bedroom. Cordelia was still asleep. The baby was asleep in the crook of her arm. Wesley sat down in the chair. He watched them sleep. He fell asleep too, sitting up, in the chair, with his boots on, Fletcher came in at some point. He put a blanket over Wesley. He did not wake him. He went back downstairs. The sun came up. 6 months later, spring, Wyoming. The ranch had a green door now, dark green, the color of pine trees in shade. Cordelia had painted it herself. Ambrose had watched her paint it and had said only one word. He had said good, which was Ambrose 4. That was the right choice. Cordelia was in the garden. She had planted along the east fence just as she had said she would. Beans, squash, corn, turnips, herbs in a smaller bed by the porch, rosemary, sage, mint. The garden was thriving. Prudence said it was because Cordelia had her mother's hands. Cordelia said it was because Prudence knew how to make compost. Both were true. Maggie was in a basket at Cordelia's feet. 6 months old, dark hair, bright eyes, very interested in her own toes. Cordelia knelt in the dirt and pulled weeds and hummed a hymn her mother had sung. Wesley came up from the barn. He had a piece of wood in his hand. He knelt down beside her. He held the wood out. Cordelia looked at it. It was a small carved horse, bigger than the 3 on the shelf in the workroom, but the same style, made by the same hand almost, except the hand was Wesley's now. She said, "You made this?" He said, "Yes." She said, "When?" He said, "Nights." She said, "For 6 months." He said, "Give or take." She said, "Wesley." He said, "Yeah." She said, "It is beautiful." He said, "It goes on the shelf if you want." She said, "Yes." He said, "All right." She said, "Wesley." He said, "Yeah." She said, "It is time." He said, "For what?" She said, "For the 4th horse." He said, "Yes." She said, "Wesley." He said, "Yeah." She said, "The horse is not the only 4th thing that goes on the shelf." He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, "Cordelia Calloway." She said, "Yes." He said, "Are you telling me something?" She said, "I am." He said, "Tell me clearer." She said, "Wesley Blackwood, I would like to be married to you before summer, if that is agreeable." He said, "Cordelia." She said, "You do not have to say yes." He said, "Cordelia." She said, "I know it is fast." He said, "Cordelia." She said, "But I have thought about it." He said, "Cordelia." "Stop." She stopped. He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." He said, "Yes." She said, "All right." He said, "All right." Maggie made a small sound in the basket. They both looked at her. She was very interested in a shadow moving across the porch. Cordelia laughed. Wesley almost laughed. Ambrose came out of the house. He looked at them, kneeling in the garden. He said, "What?" Cordelia said, "We are getting married." Ambrose said, "Finally." He went back inside. Cordelia said, "Finally." Wesley said, "He has been asking me for 2 months." Cordelia said, "About what?" Wesley said, "About when I was going to propose." Cordelia said, "You did not propose, I did." Wesley said, "Yes." Cordelia said, "Wesley." Wesley said, "Yeah." Cordelia said, "That is very like us." Wesley said, "Yes, it is." They knelt in the garden. The mountains rose to the west. The pines held the morning light. Maggie made another small sound. Somewhere in the barn, Fletcher was singing off key. Prudence was in the kitchen making bread. The ranch was full of sounds, full of people, full of a life Wesley had not thought he would ever have again. He looked at Cordelia. He said, "Thank you." She said, "For what?" He said, "For stopping on that trail." She said, "I did not stop, I fell." He said, "Then thank you for falling." She said, "You are welcome." They knelt in the dirt, with their hands in the earth and the fourth horse on the ground between them. And it was a good morning. That summer, they were married on the porch. Nothing fancy. A preacher rode up from Buffalo. Harriet came from Billings and stayed for 2 weeks. Thaddeus Whitcomb came from Helena with a wagon full of gifts. He gave Cordelia a shawl that had belonged to William's mother. He gave Maggie a small silver spoon. He gave Wesley a handshake and a long look and a nod, which was the most Thaddeus knew how to say. Prudence was matron of honor. Fletcher was best man. Ambrose walked Cordelia down the porch steps because she had asked him to. Ambrose had said, "Why me?" Cordelia had said, "Because you fed us." Ambrose had said, "That is a strange reason." Cordelia had said, "It is my reason." Ambrose had said, "All right." The preacher spoke. Wesley said his vows. Cordelia said hers. Maggie fell asleep in Harriet's arms during the ceremony. The kiss was brief, the kind of kiss that a private man and a private woman gave each other in front of witnesses, which meant it was almost nothing to look at, but it meant everything. After the ceremony, everyone ate. Prudence had baked all week. Ambrose had been cooking since dawn. There was a whole pig. There was cornbread. There was Cordelia's beans from the garden. There was a cake that Fletcher had somehow managed not to ruin. They ate on the porch. The sun set behind the bighorn. Thaddeus told stories about William as a boy. Stories Cordelia had never heard. Prudence told stories about her sister and about the Blackwood boys when they were small. Fletcher told a story about the time he tried to ride a bull, which had ended badly and which had a very long punchline. Ambrose did not tell stories, but he laughed twice, which was more than he had laughed in 3 years. At the end of the evening, Cordelia stood on the porch with Wesley. Maggie was asleep upstairs. Harriet had taken the second bedroom. Thaddeus was staying at the Brannigan place. Prudence was in the small room off the kitchen with the rocking chair, which she had claimed as her own since October. The house was full. Wesley put his arms around Cordelia from behind. She leaned back against him. They looked out at the yard, the stars over the bighorns. Millions. More stars than sky. She said, "Wesley." He said, "Yeah." She said, "William used to say the mountains do not know your history. You could just be whoever you needed to be." He said William was a wise man. She said he was. He said Cordelia. She said yes. He said I did not know I was going to be who I needed to be. She said none of us do until we are. He said I needed to be someone worth staying for. She said you are. He said you made that possible. She said so did William. He said yeah. She said so did your mother. He said yes. She said so did your father. He said yes. She said so did Voss. He said yes. She said the list is long. He said it is. She said it always is. They stood on the porch. The stars were enormous. Somewhere upstairs, Maggie made a small sound in her sleep. Cordelia listened. She said she is all right. Wesley said yes. She said so are we. Wesley said yes. She said so is the ranch. Wesley said yes. She said So is the door. He said, especially the door. She almost laughed. He almost laughed. The wind moved down off the bighorns, cool and clean. The kind of wind that carried nothing but itself. The kind of wind that came down through a green door and into a warm house full of people. Cordelia Blackwood turned around in her husband's arms. She looked at his face. She said, "Wesley." He said, "Yes." She said, "I love you." He said, "I love you." They stood on the porch a long time. They did not speak. They did not need to. And a woman who had come off a mountain trail on her hands and knees in the dirt one August afternoon stood inside a home with a green door and a small daughter asleep upstairs, and a husband whose arms were around her, and a life she had not been sure she would live to see. She was alive. The baby was alive. William's promise had been kept. Voss's name had been cleared. Cross was in a Helena courtroom. Thaddeus was in Helena on the right side of the case. Prudence had come home. Fletcher had found his voice. Ambrose had begun to smile. Wesley had begun to live. The shelf had 4 wooden horses on it, and the 4th horse, the one Wesley had carved on nights he could not sleep, sat between the 3 his mother had made, like it had always belonged there. Cordelia closed her eyes. She listened. She heard the wind. She heard the horses. She heard Maggie breathing in the room above. She heard her own heart. She heard Wesley's. She heard the whole quiet, enormous mountain evening. And she thought, this is what William meant. This is what he wanted for me. This is what he was working toward when he sat at his desk in Missouri and read those surveys and knew that he was going to have to do something dangerous. He was not just working for the law. He was working for me, for this porch, for this door, for this man, for this child, for this life. Wesley said, "Cordelia." She said, "Yes." He said, "What are you thinking?" She said that William got what he wanted. He said, "What did he want?" She said, "This." Wesley was quiet. He said, "Yeah." She said, "He would be glad." Wesley said, "I am glad too." She said, "I know." They stood on the porch until the last light was gone. Then they went inside. Cordelia locked the green door behind them, not because she was afraid, because it was hers to lock. She had never had a door of her own to lock before, and it felt like the right way to end the day. Life was not small anymore. Life was full. Life had come home, and it was good.